Okay, Shukriya Marijan. Good evening, everybody. So I have the fun task of looking at what the public are making of all of this, also then looking at where things are going to be going potentially politically after the meaningful vote next week. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, briefly look at what previous evidence has suggested on public opinion, bring things up to date, and then consider the party politics of next week's House of Commons vote. So previous evidence has suggested a number of things in terms of public opinion. We've seen both Wales and the UK continuing to be pretty evenly divided on the basic issue of whether we should remain in the EU or leave. At most, a very small swing towards remain since June 2016. That sort of aggregate level stability is underpinned by, the detailed evidence suggests, very substantial individual level stability. So, I mean, sometimes you can get polls not moving at the aggregate, reflecting, however, a bunch of people having moved one way but being cancelled out by another bunch of people moving in the other direction. On Brexit, though, we've seen very few individuals actually changing their minds over more than 2 years. Moreover, Remainers and Leavers remain divided not just on the basic issue of whether the UK should leave the European Union or not. They have sharply divergent expectations about the consequences of Brexit. And those who voted leave are much more sanguine about the likely consequences of Brexit in terms of effects on their own personal income, the economy, the state of their communities, the country, Britain's international influence, and so on. We've also seen over the last 2.5 years, though, one area where there has seemed to be some change is actually widening divides since the June 2016 referendum along lines of age, education, social class and party. It's fairly widely known that in the referendum we saw younger people much more likely to vote Remain than older voters. The more highly educated much more likely to vote Remain than those who hadn't, for instance, been to university. Working class people more likely to vote for Leave than middle class people. And significant lines are divides along lines of party support. Those divisions have, if anything, increased and sharpened in the period since the referendum. And the latest evidence, both from Wales and across the UK, I think essentially reinforces many of those points. So if we look, for instance, at views on a further referendum, within Wales, a whole series of polls from September 2016 onwards has asked people, broadly speaking, are you in favour of another vote? The red line here is people saying no, the blue line is people saying yes, and the black line is people saying don't know. And we've seen not a great deal of change. There was some suggestion of change in the latter part of last year, but in all recent polls, there is still a lead, albeit a narrow one, for people rejecting the idea of another referendum on a consistently asked question, worded the same in all polls from September 2016 onwards. On the basic issue of Remain versus Leave, again, this is a question that's been asked in exactly the same wording from, in fact, July 2016 onwards in Wales. The blue line here is Remain, the red line is Leave, the black line is those who say don't know, I wouldn't vote another referendum. Again, there is not much change. All polls in the last year have given Remain the lead in Wales, but in all cases that has been a narrow lead. No more than single figure percentages, in most cases just about 3 or 4 percentage points. Overall, very little change, at most a very tiny aggregate swing towards Remain. If we look at the withdrawal agreement, the most recent Welsh Political Barometer poll asked people 1 or 2 questions about this. We gave people, for instance, the option in a sort of preference vote, what would be your first preference? Should we remain? That's the blue bars. Should we accept the deal negotiated in the withdrawal agreement that's been discussed earlier? That's the yellow bar. Should we leave without a deal? The red bar. Or should we, or people who said don't know or I wouldn't vote in any such referendum. The not terribly good news for the government is that the least popular option, other than don't know and wouldn't vote, is accepting the deal on the table. Both leaving without a deal and Remain were more popular. But none of the positions got even close to 50%. And if we look at what happens if the withdrawal agreement is rejected and in some way is no longer on the table, the most recent poll suggested a very small advantage of, again, just a few percentage points for Remain over Leave, even when Leave means leaving without any deal at all. So even when we put the choice in those terms, that hardly shifts anything in terms of pushing more voters towards Remain. The one thing on which there has been some change and where there's a great deal of discontent is on the handling of Brexit by the UK government. And I'll outline that in a second, just though if I could show you a couple of slides. These are now then Britain-wide evidence. First of all, on the issue of Remain versus Leave, a whole series of polls aggregated here are all asking the same question. Do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the European Union? The green line is wrong, the blue line is right, and there's the don't knows at the bottom. Here we see pretty much throughout the last year, more people have been saying Britain was wrong to vote to leave the EU than right. But again, the gaps are tiny. At most, we're seeing a very small overall shift towards Remain or the idea that it was wrong to vote to leave the EU. Another series of polls have been asked consistently over the last couple of years. Should the UK, again, the same wording, should the UK remain a member of the EU or leave the EU? That's basically the referendum question back in 2016. Here, blue is the line for Remain. Again, over the last year, we have seen Remain consistently in the lead here, but only very marginally so, indicating overall a very small aggregate shift towards Remain. On Britain-wide evidence, views on a second referendum, some polls very recently have asked other questions about, for instance, a people's vote. There's a question asked by Servation just a few days ago, specifically using the language of a people's vote on the withdrawal agreement. There's a plurality in favour of that. The blue bar is support, the red bar is oppose. But again, we're some way from seeing any sort of consensus there. On the withdrawal agreement, again, a couple of polls very recently done across Britain. YouGov last week said, do you support or oppose the draft Brexit deal? Again, blue bar is support, red bar is oppose. So across Britain, as across Wales, more people seem to oppose the deal than support it, but there is no position, again, which commands 50% support. And another slightly differently worded question from YouGov very recently, should MPs specifically accept or reject the Brexit deal? Again, more people saying oppose than support, but again, no position commanding anything close to 50%, close to 50% majority support. Theresa May has rather ambitiously suggested several times in the last year and a half that the country is coming together on Brexit. I have to say I'm struggling to see the evidence of that, except on one thing. There is one thing where clearly public opinion is coming together on Brexit, and that is that in the view that her government is making a complete horlicks of it. Again, a whole series of questions asked in Britain-wide polls. How well or badly do you think the government are doing at negotiating Britain's exit from the EU? The green line here at the top, that's the proportion of people saying badly. And you don't need to be a statistical genius to see that that has generally been trending upwards. So, in terms of summary of public opinion evidence, I think we see a very consistent picture in Wales and across Britain as a whole. At most, very modest change in the direction of Remain on the basic issue of should we remain or should we leave. For the most part, it's aggregate stability, which is underpinned by individual level stability. There is no clear consensus on whether we should have a second referendum. There is clearly limited support for the withdrawal agreement. Most polls, both in Wales and across Britain, again, no matter how you word the question, find more people rejecting the withdrawal agreement than supporting it. The one thing on which there's clear consensus is declining faith in the UK government's handling of Brexit. So moving on from that cheery picture to the party politics. Joe and Rachel have expertly provided the context and talked about the legal position with regard to the meaningful vote. I want to talk about the grubby politics of all of this. So the vote a week today in the House of Commons after a number of days of debate. We know from stated party positions that the withdrawal deal is to be opposed by pretty much all the parties which are clearly in opposition: Labour, SNP, Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, and the Green MP. The DUP have been in this position of semi-opposition, semi-support for the government for some time, have clearly indicated their intention to vote against the withdrawal deal. And we've had a significant number of Conservative rebels, both those who believe in a sort of hard Brexit and don't believe that the withdrawal agreement provides a sufficient detachment from the European Union, as well as some Conservatives, a rather smaller number, who still believe that the UK should remain within the EU. A number of people on both wings of the Conservative Party have been indicated they are going to vote against the withdrawal deal. The most conservative estimate I've seen of a small c of the number of large C Conservatives who are going to vote against it still puts the number at close to 90, which for a government that's already lacking a majority would clearly deliver a very substantial parliamentary defeat for the government. And at the moment it is looking close to impossible, unless there's some extraordinary successful political manoeuvring in the next few days, it is looking close to impossible that this deal will pass the House of Commons. So if we assume that the deal will be voted down, after the deal is voted down, well, then what? Politically. Well, we're certainly into territory where the word crisis will be relevant. The rejection of the deal clearly would mean, I think partly for reasons explained by my colleagues, would mean a crisis in the Brexit process. With barely 3 months to go before we're due to leave, the only deal apparently on the table would have been rejected overwhelmingly by the British Parliament. It would also mean a governmental crisis. The UK government would be in the position where it was unable to deliver its most important, its central policy, because it had been rejected overwhelmingly by Parliament. And there would be a clear question to ask then, if the government cannot deliver on its most important, its central policy, what is the purpose of that government remaining in office? And there would also almost certainly be an internal crisis within the Conservative Party. The leader of the party and the Prime Minister would have seen her policy rejected in significant part because of determined opposition in Parliament by her own members of Parliament. So where do we go from there? Well, there's at least 4 plausible options that I think we could look towards. I think we have to be very careful in these fractious political times where we're getting minute-by-minute updates from Twitter. But I think there are at least 4 plausible things that we could see following them. However, I think all of these options come with very major problems. The first option is Prime Minister's policy is rejected overwhelmingly by Parliament. Prime Minister May finally, after having battled through many difficulties, decides that this is the moment to give up the fight, and she resigns. She goes to Buckingham Palace, offers her resignation as Prime Minister, and says she will stand down as leader of the Conservative Party. There would then be the need to find a new Conservative Party leader. And unless a consensus candidate emerges, there would need to be ballots of Conservative MPs to find 2 candidates to go to a ballot of party members. Now, given the current state of the Conservative Party, the likelihood of them being able to cohere around a single leadership candidate and Prime Minister seems somewhat implausible. This was something that the Conservative Party achieved in 2003. Of course, in that context, the Conservative Party was in opposition. It had suffered 2 successive devastating election defeats and the manifest failure of its then leader, Ian Duncan Smith, to be able to argue his way out of a wet paper bag. In that context, with the party in deep crisis, there was consensus emerging around Michael Howard, and other potential contenders withdrew. It's very unlikely in the current fractious political context that that would be the case. We would therefore need various ballots to narrow it down to the final two contenders. It would then need to go to a ballot of the party's members in the country. The process would be unlikely to be settled until well into January, possibly close to the end of January, with the Christmas break interrupting things as well. So we'd then be in a situation where we had barely 2 months left until we're due to withdraw. We have a new party leader trying to assemble a government, but with all the same problems that Prime Minister May had faced still in place, and about a month and a half less to try and deal with them. Only 2 months of the Article 50 period left. So it's very difficult to see that simply removing the Prime Minister and electing a new Conservative Party leader offers a plausible way forward that will actually solve anything much. Another possibility, which is very likely to happen, I think, particularly if the Prime Minister refuses to resign after losing in Parliament overwhelmingly next week, would be the tabling of a vote of no confidence in the government as a whole. I mean, that might still happen even if the Prime Minister does resign, but I think it's very plausible if the Prime Minister refuses to resign. On a no confidence vote, there would probably be a very close outcome. We don't yet know which way the DUP would jump in those circumstances, but they do seem at the moment very alienated from the position that Theresa May's government has taken. If they oppose the Conservative government, then it's quite possible that they could lose. Even if they abstain, things could be achingly close in the parliamentary vote. The government might just narrowly survive, but then, well, it's still in office with still all of the existing problems unresolved, and further demonstration that it lacks a comfortable and clear majority in Parliament to try and resolve them. Or, equally plausibly, the government might narrowly lose. Under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which has been some of my light reading in recent days, there are then 2 weeks to try and form an alternative government. An attempted new government has to then go before a new vote of the House of Commons that this House has confidence in Her Majesty's government. If any alternative government cannot be formed or cannot pass that parliamentary vote, then Parliament is dissolved and we're into the territory of a new general election. Just in time for Christmas. But it's difficult to see whichever way that might go that actually produces anything. Now, a new general election could therefore result from a vote of no confidence. It could also result if the Prime Minister were to respond to a Commons defeat by taking the issue to the country. The problem, I think, particularly in the latter context, but certainly also in the context of a no confidence vote, is, well, there are a number of problems. On the side of the governing party, if, for instance, the government has been defeated, the Prime Minister has been humiliated in Parliament, who leads the Conservatives in an election? Could Theresa May plausibly seek to lead a party, many of whose own MPs had just rejected her in the House of Commons on her central policy? Could she convincingly lead them into a general election? I mean, if she did, I suspect we wouldn't hear too much about strong and stable leadership in the campaign. But could she, in any plausible sense, effectively lead her party? And whether it's her or somebody else leading the party, and if she's resigned and we're into a rapid general election, who on earth else leads the party in the general election? But whoever leads the party, what on earth does the Conservative manifesto say on Brexit? If the only deal they've been able to try and get has been rejected, if that option seems closed off, what on earth could the Conservatives say? I'm old enough to remember the 1997 general election when one of the Conservatives' defeated ex-ministers, David Mellor, complained about the campaign that we just kept banging on about Europe, and on Europe we had nothing sensible to say. Well, that could seem like a dream campaign compared to the one that would result in this context. But then, what would the Labour Party, which has its own significant divisions on the issue, also? What could it plausibly say and promise on Brexit? What could it plausibly, even if it won the general election, claim as a mandate to try and deliver in the very small amount of time that would be remaining? Could any likely or even remotely plausible outcome to an election produce a parliamentary majority for a deliverable Brexit deal? That seems very doubtful. But it also seems very doubtful that any election will produce a clear parliamentary majority to reverse course, for instance, to remain. An election may well just eat up significant time and still leave all of the basic problems in the Brexit negotiations unresolved. So perhaps we should put it to the people in a second referendum, except that that ain't so simple either. The Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act of 2000 is the overall governing legislation within which referendums now take place in the UK. And put simply, that act has also been some of my light reading recently. That actually makes it very difficult to hold a referendum in the available time. I mean, it provides, for instance, for the Electoral Commission to do a period of consultation about the question, which is normally specified in legislation as being a minimum of 12 weeks. Well, 12 weeks from next week's vote takes us up to mid-March. That's before you've even had the question approved for the referendum. I mean, one could try to short-circuit the legislation by getting agreement in Parliament to rush something through and have a referendum much more quickly, except that we've just talked about Parliament not being able to agree anything. So what is the plausible prospects of this Parliament being able to agree and come to consensus on a referendum and then rush legislation on that through Parliament? Yeah, good luck with that one. And a referendum, whenever it was held, what is the actual question? What is the choice? Is it the withdrawal agreement versus a no-deal Brexit? That would leave a great number of people, much of the people who continue to support Remain, deeply discontented that they were not given a vote that included their most preferred option. Do we offer the withdrawal agreement against Remain, which would deeply discontent many people who support a hard Brexit? If the withdrawal agreement has been voted down by Parliament, do we simply have the two binary options of remain in the EU or leave without any agreement at all? Is there no possible middle ground? Or do we even have a three-way referendum, as some people have termed it, a preferendum, where we use the voting system that was rejected in the 2011 referendum of preferential voting to see if we got the 2016 UK referendum correct? What would be likely to result in a preferendum is no option getting majority first preference support, and there's a potential even some very peculiar political games about which option you try and get, for instance, into second place and then vote transfers and so on. And certainly having a referendum like that, using a voting system that people have never used before in a referendum, would surely require a lengthy period of campaigning for the whole process to be explained properly to the people. It would be very difficult to try and rush that through before the end of March. So, the good news then. The public and the political elites on Brexit remain deeply divided. And there are, frankly, no clear paths to an obvious solution. Indeed, all of the potential ways that have been suggested as ways forward have major political implications and seem to come with extremely substantial potential political problems. So on that cheery note, goodbye. Thanks very much.